the biggest takeaway is if we actually want to connect with people and build trust with them, do shared activities that you actually enjoy.
How you doing?
I'm super excited to be here. I've been a little under the weather, so I figured this is like the perfect opportunity for a turning point to be on your podcast. So thanks for having me.
I heard about that before the call, and I'm sorry to hear, but honored that you took the time, even though you're in healing phase right now, to be with me. And we got a lot to cover, so let's get into it.
Let's do it.
And where I want to start, John, is actually at another point in your life when you weren't doing so great. And this is all the way back, age 28. And at the time, you were overweight, you were broke, things just weren't going well. And, like a lot of times in life, when we hit a point where, everything's falling apart, it can sometimes be the catalyst for change. And in your case, it was. So I'll have you take it from there and talk about what was going on other than being broke and overweight. What was life like at that time, and how did you come out of it?
So I'm a person who really throws myself into whatever I think might be able to improve the quality of my life. And so I would do courses and read books and so on. And one of the things that I jumped into was a seminar. And a seminar leader said something that really had me re-examine the entire way my life is set up. He said that the fundamental element that defines the quality of our lives are the people we surround ourselves with and the conversations that we have with them. And he said, that means that if you want to impact your life, what you need to do is either change the conversations that you're having with people or change the people you're having them with. And that was fundamentally different than what everybody else was saying. I was setting my alarm for like crazy early in the morning and then hitting snooze 8,000 times and skipping the gym and feeling bad about it. And he's now saying, maybe you should just hang out with a bunch of people who fitness is part of their life. And then instead of going to the movies and eating a tub of popcorn, you'll meet them for a run. And then it becomes natural for your life. Well, I'm a science geek. I'm a behavioral scientist now. And so I looked at the research, and there was this crazy study by these two guys, Christakis and Fowler, and they were actually looking at the obesity epidemic. And they were curious, does it spread from person to person like a cold? Or is it a percentage of the population like Alzheimer's, right? You don't get Alzheimer's because you shook hands with somebody who has Alzheimer's. And what they found was startling. If you have a friend who's obese, your chances increase by 45%. Your friends who don't even know them have a 20% increased chance, and their friends have a 5% increased chance. And this kind of effect is true for happiness, marriage and divorce rates, smoking habits, voting habits. Literally everything spreads from person to person. And so I figured my biggest responsibility for my life would be to not only connect with extraordinary people, the ones that could have a really meaningful impact on my life, but to have them connect with each other so it spreads further. And that was kind of this epiphany. The problem was I frankly didn't come from like one of those super connected rich families. My parents are immigrants, and so I had to then figure out how to connect with the people I admired most.
Well, we talked about this was at 28 years old. What were your relationships like at that time? Did you have a lot of close friends, or how was those waters?
I grew up, I was like super unpopular. I mean, like in grade school, my teacher once handed out an assignment that each of us could secretly submit two people we wanted to sit with and two people we didn't want to sit with. And what ended up happening was I found out two kind of interesting things that day. One was that there was one kid nobody wanted to sit with, and the second was that was me. And so I grew up like super geeky in a time when, it wasn't cool to like computers or Marvel comics and things like that. As I grew up, I developed friendships for sure, but I never really felt like I had my niche. I had a bunch of friends and even a couple of close friends, but I didn't really feel like I was ever part of a meaningful community. And Um, that was something I really longed for. Uh, but don't get me wrong, it's not like I had a terrible life. It was just it, I didn't have those relationships that I really dreamt of.
So you're at this seminar. What is the seminar where you have this epiphany?
Oh, it's called Wisdom Unlimited. It's by a company called Landmark Education, and they offer it, I think, like once a year. I did it back around 2008, 2009.
Okay. And what got you hooked into all this personal development? How did you get so fascinated by improving yourself?
Huh, that's a great question. Um, I would say that my parents instilled a growth mindset. This idea that there's studies done on people who uh, tend to be more happy and more active in life, and one of the characteristics is called the locus of control. It's, do you believe that you can have an impact on the things in your life or not? And the people who believe that they can actually have a larger impact, regardless if it's possible or not, end up feeling more empowered and taking more action in their life. And so I think that my parents instilled a very large locus of control. This idea that if you're willing to put in the effort, improvement is an option. And as a child, I struggled a ton because I'm dyslexic. And so I was very clear that like consistent effort actually breeds results, right? Like I was the last kid to learn to read, but I still learned to read. I had resource rooms and support and that kind of stuff, and I needed it, but like I figured it out eventually. And so I think that uh, that was probably one aspect. And the second was that because I'm dyslexic, I realized that where I excel was not where everybody else excelled. And so I figured out like, or got really good at the things that other people never needed to. So I got good at memorization and like mental math and things like that so that I could avoid writing. And, um, and so I think I became kind of like a learning junkie for the non-traditional stuff.
So once you had that epiphany in the seminar and you talked about coming out and finding that research about how contagious it is, the people that you're around, and how that can even spread not just through the people that you're directly in contact with, but through multiple people. So how long did it take you to come across that research?
It's, now we're talking 12, 13 years back. Uh, it was probably sometime around, there's this impression that like innovation happens in a moment, but it's really like a series of very steady steps along the way. And, um, and so it's probably within, a couple months of each other.
Okay, so when you come across that, what do you decide to do? Take me through the steps. You're feeling, you're in this low, and obviously, when you're going through a tough time, it can be hard to find motivation and to really, you know, get inertia going. So how did you get things rolling?
What I realized was that if I'm going to surround myself with people, I wanted it to be the most uh, impressive or people or those that I admired the most. So not just a business leader, but somebody who's really got the respect of their peers. Not just a writer, but maybe somebody who earned a Pulitzer Prize or something like that. And I realized that I didn't know anything about what their lives are like and why they would actually want to talk to me. It was very clear that emailing them asking if I could treat them to coffee just won't work, right? They probably get 1,000 of those a day. Uh, so I actually went around and started speaking to like personal assistants and admins and asking if they could tell me about those people's lives. Or maybe they would arrange for me to get to talk to them for a few minutes just so I could get like a peek into what their life was like to see if I could provide some value or what I could do that would actually cause them to want to connect. Because the fact of the matter is, it's really easy to get people's attention, right? People always complaining, oh, it's so hard to get people. It's really easy to get people's attention. It's very hard, though, to get their interest. And I didn't just want to get like a selfie with Richard Branson. What's that going to do for me, right? Bragging rights. I wanted their interest. I wanted to be viewed as a peer that they respect. And so I needed to go a completely different angle. And what ended up coming out from all these interviews and conversations and really talking it through with people was that there were generally 5 universal characteristics that that has people that operate at that level, at the industry level, uh, has people approach them. So they're usually approached for their social clout, their time, their expertise, their access, and their money. And it's like donations, or it's buy my company, or invest, give me a contract, whatever it is, right? And so if everybody's after something, I need to figure out how to get past all of that. And so I started analyzing, okay, where are they going? Why are they going to these places? And so if you look, I actually ended up figuring out that there were 4 elements that if you put them in place, incredibly influential people will not only have interest, but will go far out of their way to connect with you. And that's how I kind of got my start. I said, okay, I need something that has these 4 elements, and maybe I'll be able to really get their interest.
I see. Well, let's get into the 4 elements.
All right. So the first one was generosity, or still is. And the reason that generosity is so important is twofold. The first is that if everybody's after something, then their defenses tend to be up, right? So Jesse, if every email you got was, I want to be on your podcast, which it might be for all I know, it's going to make you a little weary every time you open your inbox, right? But if instead you get an invitation that has no strings attached, and it's clear that nobody's after something from you, it lets you breathe easy, right? So the interesting thing is, if you look at the research on generosity, something really interesting happens. Adam Grant wrote this great book called Give and Take about people who are givers, generous, those who are takers, selfish, and matchers, those that will just copy whatever behavior they're treated with. If you give them something, they'll give back. If you don't, they don't. And he asked, who are the least successful and who are the most successful? So the least successful are the givers, those that are generous. But what was really surprising is that the most successful, do you want to take a guess, or should I just tell you?
I'll say the takers.
And no, it's actually the givers. The givers are both the most and the least successful. And
How so?
what's interesting is, if you know where to draw the line and when to stop giving, that's when you become really successful. Because if, let's say we work together and I just keep giving you all my leads, I'm going to fail and you'll succeed. So I'm over giving, right? But if you're starting out and you're having a tough time and I give you a few leads and then I focus on the work that I need to, then you'll probably support me moving forward. So in that case, I've been generous and I've probably earned your support if you're a matcher or giver. And I've also made sure that I get my own work done. And so that research was done on like med students who are studying, right? So if I don't study what I need to because I'm only helping you, I'm going to fail. But if I help you and then focus on what I need to, I'll end up being way ahead. And so it was also repeated with salespeople and all that kind of stuff. The important thing here is that it really pays off to be generous, but it also is important to note the type of generosity. So with highly influential people, it's not the type of generosity where I'm giving you like a bunch of product or something like that. I don't know. Do you have a phone? I'm assuming.
Yes. Yeah, of course.
What phone do you use?
Apple.
Great. If Samsung came to you and gave you the new Samsung phone, would you switch?
No.
Exactly. Because we don't value what we're given. So when we're talking about generosity, I'm talking generosity of knowledge, generosity of experience. I'm specifically looking for opportunities to be generous in a way that will cause us to bond more, right? Not just to transact. The second characteristic is novelty. Now, here's what's interesting. The most influential people in our culture do not need another casino-themed fundraiser to go to. They've been to like 200 of them, right? It just doesn't stand out anymore. Nobody cares. And that's the problem, is that nothing stands out anymore. But there's a section of the brain called the SNVTA. It's the major novelty center. And when we trigger it, it actually causes us to want to explore and understand what we're being exposed to. It literally gets people out of their house. And so I knew I needed something that was different, something that would pique their interest. And just think about it. Is there something that you really like I don't know, movies, theater, whatever it is, right? You'll notice that if it's too familiar, if it's just a copycat of everything that already exists, it doesn't pique your interest. But suddenly, like Hamilton comes out and they're like, wow, this is completely different. Suddenly everybody wants to go, right? So you end up in these situations that most of the time we're not getting people's attention because what we're doing is not interesting in any way, shape, or form. The third characteristic is kind of interesting to me because if I were to ask you, who do you think the most influential people in our culture spend their time with? And you actually hadn't read my book. I know you read my book. So most people would guess, oh, they spend their time with other influential people. But the truth is they don't. They became influential mostly because of hard work, which means that they spend most of their time with their admins and their staff. Maybe now that people are locked in their homes because of COVID, they're spending a lot of time with their family, maybe. But it means that if you can curate an environment with other interesting people, they will go far out of their way for it. They'll not only go far out of their way for it, they'll even pay a fortune, right? So you look at the probably most exclusive events in the world, like Davos. I think it costs $250,000 to go, to stand in the snow, hoping to bump into, I don't know, Andrea Merkel's and Sir Richard Branson. That's crazy. It's like freezing cold and slushy snow, but people are willing to do it because it's so well curated. It's similar to TED. People pay anywhere from, $10,000 to $50,000 to attend. And so curation is incredibly powerful when it comes to developing interest. And then the final thing I would say, and this is not a requirement, but if you can trigger it, it's incredible, is arguably the most desired human emotion or experience is awe or wonder. Now, you might think, why not love or happiness? Well, those things you tend to experience possibly throughout the day. But awe is something that people experience a handful of times, right? That moment when you realize how big the universe is, or when people hold their child for the first time. If you could trigger some form of that, it actually causes people to feel more generous and more connected. Now, it is a very high bar, granted, which is why I say it's really not a requirement. In fact, if you can even do one of these four things really well, people will go out of their way. If you've got two, you've got a hit. If you've got three, you're going to approach legendary status, right? If you actually can do all four consistently, I will literally sign up immediately. I don't care how much it is, right? And that's kind of the interesting thing about these characteristics. They're fundamental drivers that are at the core for most people.
Well, Jon, let's come back to your story and at that point in your life when you're, just starting to garner influence. How do you go about doing it? Take us through your personal experience of building that up, starting in the early years.
Okay, so I was just about probably 28, 29 at the time. And I was starting to get a peek into the way that highly influential people operate. I was trying to understand their social pressures, right? This whole thing about people being after their social clout and time, expertise, and so on. And so initially I thought, okay, maybe I'll set up a monthly or weekly phone call where people can call in and talk to each other. That was an utter failure. And then I realized that those people are probably most available in the evenings and weekends, but I'm not going to get them that much during the weekends because many of them have like country houses or that's their family time and can't be disturbed. So my best bet was evenings. And if it's the evening, then it probably needs to, then I probably need to feed them. And so uh, I didn't know exactly what yet. And this actually isn't a story that many people have heard. But while I was trying to figure this out, and it took me months to formulate an idea, I think literally from beginning to end, it took 6 months. I had 3 or 4 people, it was 4 people come over for dinner. We were supposed to meet at my house and go out and go to a restaurant. And then I don't even know who had said it. It may have been me, it may have been one of the guests. Why don't we just grab some supplies from the local supermarket and cook together and just hang out? And what happened was that after cooking together, by the end, it would just like hanging out with old camp friends, as if these people knew each other for years, even though they'd never met before. And that's when I realized what I was going to do. I was going to get the most influential people in our culture to come to my home, cook me dinner, wash my dishes, clean my floors, and then thank me for it. And so I started off mostly with people that I knew. They weren't the most impressive. They were like solidly successful, but not like you wouldn't go, oh, wow, you got to host that person, right? They're not celebrity status. And at the first dinner, it was a total mess. I mean, like literally an embarrassing mess. It was, I think, summer. The air conditioner broke. People were sweating while chopping food. The kitchen was too small. Like everything that could go wrong went wrong. And we had set up a rule that people couldn't talk about what they did. And then we'd do a reveal once we sat down. And so we would go around. And I mean, like people were, like full on sweating, dabbing. And they loved it. And they loved it because it was generous, novel. The people were wonderful. It was well curated. And I wouldn't say it was awe-inspiring by any stretch, not at the early stages. But what we did do, which is a really interesting quirk of human behavior, is that we didn't just supply food, right? I could have invited you over and dinner was ready and then you sit down and eat. But it turns out that there's this weird quirk of human behavior called the Ikea Effect. And the Ikea Effect states that we disproportionately care about our Ikea furniture because we had to assemble it. And it turns out that anything we put effort into, we care about disproportionately. And so I realized that instead of just supplying dinner, by cooking together, people will put effort into one another, and that will grow their relationship and have them care more about each other and the meal. And let's be honest, 12 people who don't know how to cook, especially the poor quality food I was buying at the broke age of 28, 29, was not going to come out tasty. And so they needed to be both drunk and well invested. So I made sure that there was plenty of liquor, and I also made sure that they cared about the outcome. So the success of the dinner is actually more a byproduct of people investing effort than it being a dinner. And what ended up happening was that I did the first one. It was great. We had a party after. More people came and hung out. It took like 6 months until I did the next one. It was super fun. And in the meantime, every event that I went to, I would talk about this dinner series as if it's the greatest thing ever. And people would sometimes say, oh, I'd love to come. This sounds great. I'd collect more and more interesting people. And by probably the 4th or 5th dinner, I started having really just kind of like far more successful people come. One person was working at The Daily Show, had won an Emmy. They invited me to a party where I got to meet the rest of like the writers for the Colbert Report and all like. And so I started getting pulled into these different circles that were fascinating to me. And I just keep inviting them. And by like the 15th or 20th dinner, the New York Times approached me and said, "Hey, we'd like to write about it." And I was like, "No, that's okay. I kind of like being off the grid." And they're like, "We're the New York Times." And I was like, "Okay." And so they came, they photographed and wrote a piece about it. And it became one of the most popular stories ever, I think, for the style section. It was on the cover of the style section. And then within the New York City culture, it developed kind of this legendary status. And the structure changed a bit over the years. So it's 12 people. They're not allowed to talk about what they do or give their last name. They cook dinner. We sit down to eat and we play a game where we guess what people do. And nobody is almost ever right because it's really hard to guess. And then we hang out together. And after about half of the dinners, I run a salon where former dinner guests are invited back, usually about 60 to 100. And we have 3 of the members present. And so it'll be like Bill Nye talking about his new book, and then we'll have one of the Roots perform or something like that. And it's pretty fantastic. I've been, what is it? I've done 227 dinners in 10 cities in 3 countries, over 2,000 guests. And we've hosted Olympians, Nobel laureates, celebrities, anyone you could imagine has come to these dinners. So it's been pretty wild.
Incredible story. And you mentioned the first dinner. I want to come back to this. And you mentioned how the air conditioning broke during the dinner. And I'm not sure if there were other things, other hiccups. I'm imagining so because, this is your first time putting something like this on. But you did say the people there loved it. What I'm curious about, because of the air conditioning breaking and maybe other hiccups you had, did you ever contemplate not continuing it?
Oh, for
Or right
sure.
away did you know this I just need to kinda iron these things out and I have something here?
Oh my God. So many times I considered not. I want, like, I was so heavily in debt from college, right? Tens of thousands of dollars. Um, I was barely making ends meet, barely covering my expenses. And even though these dinners in the early stages weren't crazy expensive by marketing standards, right? The What a company will spend to host the same people that I do is 10, 20, 30, $40,000 on an event. I was spending maybe a couple $100, but it was still a lot for me. Like, it was a fortune for me. A couple $100 on a dinner every couple of months was like, I just didn't have that. And sometimes I'd have to, like, put more on my credit card as a byproduct. Uh, but I, so there were a lot of points where I was like, oh, I can't afford to do it next month, right? Or the month after. I was also dedicating a crazy amount of time pretending to be my own assistant, emailing people and inviting them. And so it became my evening social activity. While my friends were off like at bars having drinks, I was like writing email after email, inviting people, trying to figure out how to optimize our communication to get the best response. I was looking at, okay, do I need a website so people take us more seriously? Or do I keep it off the grid so it's this like secret New York thing, right? This became kind of my obsession over time. And it was a lot of work. If I had invested the same amount of effort, I could have had a serious startup, like a serious startup. Um, but I don't regret it for a second. And that's because I fundamentally believe that that instructor and that wisdom course was right. The people we surround ourselves with define the quality of our life. And the greatest thing I ever did for myself was figure out how to bring together extraordinary people. Because frankly, I'm the one person who doesn't really deserve to be in the room. But that's okay because I'm the one person who knows how to bring people together. And that's really valuable. I didn't need the industry award. I don't have a Nobel Prize, clearly, right? I don't have an Academy Award or any of these things. I was some, like, in most cases, 31, 32-year-old kid by when it was really picking up, who just figured out how to like trick everybody to cook him dinner, and it worked. But I'll also point out, the design of the dinner wasn't just for me. It was for all of them to improve their lives through making really great friends. And to this day, literally more than a decade later from the first dinners, people are still hanging out with each other, still super close friends. And I'm incredibly proud of that. And I'm incredibly proud that when COVID hit, I mean, thousands upon thousands of dollars were donated by the community to help relief efforts, and projects were done to help, different communities, from musicians who are out of work to frontline medical care workers. I mean, these people are doing really wonderful work to have an impact on some of the biggest social issues. I'm really proud that we get to be involved.
John, I'm picturing you in the early days, typing away behind the computer, sending these emails out, pretending to be your assistant. Was a big part of your success in the beginning of connecting with these influential people? Was it a numbers game, sending out like 50 emails and then getting one response? And I know before you talked about it's
It's
not just
still.
reaching out to the person at the top of the food chain. You're connecting with maybe their assistant or people that are associated with them. But talk about that and how that's changed over time.
So I think there's a few things. The first was when I was 30 years old or 29, my priority was like, first of all, I had like this completely confused perspective on the world. I thought everybody's priority was to like go get drunk and hang out with people. I didn't realize like there are a ton of people out there who are sober. So by my current standards, those invitations we were sending out were so cringeworthy, right? They talked about like the cocktails that we made. Like there was all this kind of stuff that was focused on all the wrong elements. And I'm happy that we grew out of our awkward stage, right? The Was it a numbers game? Yes, but not in like the same way that it could be considered now. So in the early days, it was almost all people I'd met while I was out, because we didn't develop enough street cred for a random stranger to accept an invitation, right? Eventually that happened. Um, And then eventually I discovered virtual assistants, and that saved my life, because then I could just, produce documents explaining our standard practices, and they would handle all the email communication for me. But what was even more interesting was I didn't realize how easy it was to find people's email addresses. So if you want to get a hold of a Nobel laureate, their email addresses are public because they're usually at universities. If you want to get a hold of like an Olympian, chances are it's their first dot last name at Gmail, right? Like people's email addresses are super predictable. If you know the one email address at a company, you kind of know everybody's at the company. Like, Bill Gates' email address is probably Bill at Microsoft. It's not like these things aren't secrets, right? So getting in touch with them isn't necessarily the problem, right? And I said this earlier, it's not about getting their attention, it's about getting their interest. So as often as possible, I would try to get a warm intro so that people wouldn't think that I'm like a scam of some kind. Even with my street cred from the New York Times article and the later articles, and then TED Talk and all that, it's so funny. There's this moment just about 15 minutes after people arrive at every dinner where we're like, people are having some drinks, and then we're about to go cook. And there's this moment where I say, hey, I know some of you were worried that you were going to have your kidneys stolen uh, or be kidnapped. If you need to go text your spouses to let them know you're alive, please go ahead and do it. And every time, still, like 3 people get up and go and text their spouses or their friends. They're like, oh, that's so funny. I actually sent the address to a few friends so people know where I was. And I'm like, we've been covered by literally every outlet. Vogue, Elle, the New York Times, Boston Globe, like you name it, we've been in it. And still people are like, a quarter of people are still concerned that I'm about to steal their kidneys. So I think it kind of goes to show that, that no matter how much credibility you have, people are still skeptical, and they're also still willing to participate, which I think is super, super funny. So to answer your numbers game question, the early days was mostly word of mouth, so people I was introduced to, and we would just email them. Nowadays, the bigger problem is that the people that we're connecting with have such big lives that the probability that they'll be available on any particular date is near zero, right? So we invite probably 200, 220 people to fill a 12-person dinner. That is not great odds. That's a 5% positive response rate. Now, we don't view it as a numbers game because it's just not the way we like to talk about our community. But if you were looking purely at what it takes to fill a dinner, it's credibility and about, a 5% positive response rate.
So you talked about before how $200 buying the ingredients for one of these dinners was a big setback for you at the time in the early days. What were you doing for a career at that time? Like, what was your day job? You talked about how this was during the week, at night. What did you do to make a living?
At the time, I was, let me think back. I was doing work. I had a 6-month contract at the largest caterer in New York uh, because they were revitalizing their technology and digital strategy. And I came in to help them with that. And then uh, after that, I was working for another tech company. So I was doing kind of like these 6-month or 4-month stints at different tech companies, but nothing special or extraordinary by any stretch of the imagination. And then eventually I ended up at Rodale, which is Men's Health, Women's Health, Runner's World, like the company that used to own all those. It eventually sold to Hearst. Um, and when they closed that department down, I just ran the influencers, which is what the organization is called, full time. Uh, and I started consulting for companies, uh, demonstrating how to apply behavioral science to the way that they connect with their customers. And it was kind of an interesting process. Like it was a really hard transition going from corporate to kind of building my own business and thought leadership, and it took a few years till it really caught on. I once again got pretty close to broke, and then um, eventually business kind of picked up, and I was able to prove my use case.
So let's talk about maintaining the quality of these relationships. You get together, you have this special night together, you're cooking and forming that bond. But then how does that bond, stick together over a period of time? I know you talked about earlier how after one of these dinners you'll invite the alumni to come and you'll have a group of them maybe come join you guys after the dinner. But how do you go about as your network continues to expand? How do you go about keeping track of all these different people that are, at one point at least were impactful in your life? And how do you go about maintaining a quality relationship and not just, a numbers game thing again?
So I think that there's a few things. The first is that nobody's going to be able to manage every relationship at scale every day, right? It's just not a fair expectation of yourself. Some people are naturally going to become what others call loose ties, right? Like they're people you kind of know, you'll bump into them occasionally, but they're not necessarily like people that you want to be besties with. Now, and some will, there's like probably, I don't know, 10, 15% that came once and will never come again, right? Al Jaffe, who's probably the oldest person who's ever come, is like 95. He came to one dinner. He's not going to keep coming to things that are in the evening. It's too late for him and so on. Totally get it. Al, I stay in touch with over email and checking in on him every so often, but that's just because he's a hero of mine. He was the artist for Mad Magazine. I thought that was super cool. So the issue is that most people deal with relationships with like a hub and spoke model. They say, okay, there's me in the middle, and I know Steve, I know Jesse, I know Mark. And in order to keep all those relationships, they tend to be the ones that have to do the outreach. It's a fine way to live, but it's exhausting. The other option is if Mark, Jesse, Steve, Malik, Sandra, whatever it is, all know each other and they're all connected to one another, then we're part of a community. And when that's the case, when I hang out with you, Jesse, then naturally we'll chat about the others and I'll get updates. And you'll chat with them about me and they'll get updates. And so I don't have to be responsible for making sure that everybody is constantly hearing from me because we're in each other's orbits. That's part of the reason that we have the salons, is that the dinner functions more like pledge week, right? And once you're in the sorority or fraternity, you're in, and you feel like you belong to something. And when you feel like you belong to something, then there's a greater sense of community and a greater connection between the members, even if they've never met before. So something I often hear is that when people come and they say, oh, you were at dinner? Who's at your dinner? Oh, my dinner, I had these people. It gives them this common ground that they know that they're in the inner circle. And so it lets them feel more connected. So I use the salons to allow for the connections between people to increase so that we naturally become more part of each other's lives, even if I don't get to see them all the time. And so my secret to managing, I mean, like I can give you little tips about when I text people and email them and all that kind of stuff. But I'm a strong believer that you give people an experience that initiates them or welcomes them into a community, and then you consistently provide a platform for them to connect with each other, especially without you, if you can, because you don't want people's interactions to be dependent on you if you actually want them to grow. If you make it always dependent on you, it's actually kind of egotistical, unless you're really focused on quality control, like maybe TED, right? Listen, I get it, but it's just not what I care about. I want people to connect with each other and go out to dinner together, make friends, travel the world, whatever it is, start a company, cure a disease.
I hear what you're saying there. But let's get a little more granular now. You brought up sending a text or an email. Let's get into the nuances of what that might look like. Do you like have reminders and that pop up and say, have you connected with this person in a certain amount of time, or how, because again, somebody like you who is connected to so many people, it would be easy enough for years to go by and not have any kind of connection.
See,
So
yeah. And listen, sometimes that happens. It's over 2,000 people. So the first thing is that every single one of my members gets messages from us every time we host an event in their city. So that's usually monthly. So that means that a month before the event, they get an invite. 2 weeks later, they get a follow-up. Then if they're coming, they get the reminders. And we get to see them at the events. When we launched digital events, everybody, doesn't matter which part of the world they were in, they were getting an invite from us. So we constantly have outgoing communications inviting them. Then about, I don't know, once a month, once every other month, me and my team will go through the entire list and say, and I'll to update information, or maybe we're trying to help a social cause or something and we promise to make some introductions. And we'll go, okay, I need to send a message to each of these people. And it'll probably be like a list of 20 people. And I'll just send them personal notes saying, hey, it'd be great to catch up, or just thinking about you. If somebody pops into my mind, I'll send them a text right away that literally says, hey, I just want you to know, I think you're awesome. There's nothing else. I'm not asking for anything. That was it. That's the end of the message. I hope you're great and that I get to see you sometime soon. And the reason I do that is that people in their situation are often, being approached for a lot, and just getting a message being like, I think you're awesome, is it's really wonderful when, especially over the past year and a half, people have been under so much pressure and so stressed, so many distractions, that just to be reminded that people care is really nice. Um, and then there's something I love doing, which is introductions. So, Jesse, is there a big project you're working on in your life right now?
Not specifically. Not just continuing to crank out great interviews and had a daughter year coming up on a year and a half ago, and
Wow, COVID
we have
baby.
another kid on the way, and so family life is a priority right now, and so we're looking to move too. So a lot of personal stuff, and then I just love what I do with connecting with people like you on the show and reading their books, and it keeps me more than busy. So nothing atypical right now, but
Yeah.
I'm sure that'll come.
So when somebody does have something, they're like, "Oh, I'm thinking of a career change, whatever it is," then I immediately go, "Okay, let's talk. What are your big priorities?" And then I'll say, "Here's 10 people, look them up. If you want an intro to any of them, I'll check if it's okay, and I'll make it." And what I love about introductions, love, is that in the 5 minutes it takes me to write it, I've given you a new future that I don't have to be involved in, right? When you had your first child, you created a new future that you had to be involved in, right? There's a lot of work involved, and it's incredible and joyous and rewarding, right? But there's also something really nice about I make that intro, and now suddenly you can talk to an Academy Award winning director about how to make film, and you can see if that's actually something that you want to do, right? And that has the potential of creating a new future that doesn't require any more work on my side. And that's wonderful to me. So I really enjoy making introductions. And it also serves to strengthen the social ties between the people in the community. So I feel like it's a win all around. And here's what's really interesting. So you are a highly experienced podcaster. And if I go, "Jesse, I have a friend who's awesome, who's thinking about podcasting. Would you be up for chatting with them? I know you're like a superstar at this." Now, the moment that I go to you, something interesting happens. You know you're a really solid podcaster. And if I'm coming to you, I must be really smart to come to you for advice. So now I've both complimented you and I've supported the idea in your head that I'm smart, that I've come to. And I've also introduced you to somebody who, in my social circles, tend to be interesting. So it's a win all around. And when you look at the way that trust is created, it's generally created through these kind of micro actions, these small investments of effort like the Ikea effect, specifically something called a vulnerability loop. And in the book, I kind of describe it like if Jesse, me and you were walking down the street and I said, Jesse, I'm so stressed out by this book. It's been more work than I ever expected. In that moment, I've signaled vulnerability. Now, what would happen if you were to make fun of me or ignore my signal? Trust would be reduced. But if you acknowledge it and say, and signal in response, "John, I know how you feel. Everybody talks about how hard it is to be a parent. Man, oh man, life is crazy." In that moment, we've both signaled vulnerability to the same level and we're safe with each other. So trust increases. When I come to you and I ask you for advice, I open a vulnerability loop. And when you close it, trust between us increases. And as you invest effort giving me more advice, then the Ikea effect kicks in and you end up caring more about me.
And I know one of the examples you like to use is the example of asking somebody for complex directions, and you're much more likely to get turned down if you just straight up ask for the directions versus asking them a simple question, ask for the time, get an answer from that, and then you're forming that start of a relationship and then asking for the directions. So
Yes.
just another way of looking at that.
I love it. I love that you remember that. Yeah, it's true for anything, right? So let's say you have a startup and you want to talk to an investor. Don't ask them to review like a 20-minute presentation. Ask them a simple question. Start off with, is there a certain type of format that you like? Is there a presentation that I should go check out because you think it was the best presentation you've ever seen? That's like a 2-second answer. I'd even label that message super quick question. Hey, I've watched 20 interviews with you. I've never heard you answer this question. And that demonstrates that I did my research, so I'm not bothering them with something that's already out there. And then I say, I have a big presentation coming up. Is there one or two that you really recommend as perfect examples? I'm happy to Google them and track them down. Thank you. And now that'll literally be like, that's a quick email that they'll dictate or using Siri or whatever. Then you can go back and say, oh my God, that was so good. I based my presentation on it. And you can say, hey, can I show you the video? Or would you be up for checking out the slides? I mimicked the model that you suggested. And that way you're stacking from small to large, getting them to invest more and more effort and caring more and more about your startup in the process.
John, what I love you brought up earlier, the fact that you like to do these introductions and connect different people. And I'm just curious if you've always been that way, because I could see it from, the other side where you could feel like, I was broke and I've been working blood, sweat, and tears to connect with these people over the years and build up my Rolodex, and you want to keep that clung and tightly to yourself and not share it. So just playing
Mm-hmm.
devil's advocate, I really love the way that you were so open and generous when you talked about connecting individuals. So talk about first, has that always been the case with you? And two, why that's just such a better way of looking at it. Like let's bring a win together for each and everybody instead of hoarding it all to yourself.
So it's I love that you call it hoarding. Um, yeah, I believe a lot of people hoard contacts, and I wasn't as open to it as I am now, but I was definitely more inclined to sharing relationships than quote unquote hoarding it. And mind you, I don't introduce everyone to everyone. I've people in my life that just aren't particularly responsible, and I wouldn't I wouldn't trust them with the follow through and the follow ups, and I don't want it to look bad on me. I do it when somebody has demonstrated that they have a level of competence that I can rely on. So when you hoard contacts, it actually weakens the relationship because it means that you have kind of this fear of reaching out to them, and it almost suggests that like, oh my God, if my friends knew each other, they would find out that like what, I'm dishonest, that I'm like a bad person, that I'm embezzling money. Like, what is the risk of having people meet each other if you're an authentic person? Now, granted, maybe you're concerned because you have friends that are across party lines or religious, whatever it is, that you're worried won't be able to get along. Okay, maybe on the rare occasion that that's the case. Uh, but even then, at the dinners, we have people who are like, at one of the dinners, a woman said, turned to the guy next to her and said, I couldn't like you more and couldn't dislike your views more. And that's the perfect example of two dinner guests. Are people that can hold diametrically opposed views of the world, but still really like each other. So hoarding contacts is actually a really weak place to be because it means that every point of contact that you have with the people in your world requires you to make the effort or hoping that one of them will reach out to you, which happens, sure, if you're friends with them. Now, if they're all connected to each other, then they always stay in your orbit. There's this very cynical theory of social interaction that says, all right, Jesse, if I introduce you to 5 of my friends, you are not going to have the time to go and maintain friendships with everybody you currently know. So you're going to have to prune 5 relationships. And as a byproduct of you giving up 5 relationships elsewhere, because there's a limit on your time, and staying in contact with the 5 that I just introduced you to, I've just pulled you closer into my social circle. So by your contacts knowing each other, you've actually made them better friends because they're part of your community as opposed to them being a contact. I'm also opposed to this idea that, oh, we shouldn't bother people. We shouldn't ask for favors. We shouldn't ask people for their advice. Now, there's certain people that I know are so busy that they don't check their text messages as often. They're so overwhelmed, right? They're celebrities and stuff like that. But you better believe that when it was my niece's bat mitzvah, I was messaging Trevor Noah for a happy bat mitzvah video. And I made sure that the entire staff of The Daily Show was helping me out to make sure that video came in, because I knew that he would be happy to do it. He's just totally overwhelmed, and it would mean the world to her. But like I asked, because that's how you build relationships, is investing effort into one another. It's that Ikea effect, those vulnerability loops. And so I'm a strong believer that even if it's people who are high profile, if you actually want to develop a relationship with them, you don't keep them far away. You find ways to invest effort into one another.
I like that. And earlier, when you were making a separate point, you pointed out the fact that if somebody were to take on, say, 5 new friends, maybe they would have to get rid of 5 friends they already have in their circle.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to expand upon that and talk about that for a bit, because
Mm-hmm.
this kind of ties into what we were talking about before, having that keeping in touch with all these different people that you're connecting with, all the different influencers, how you make sure to stay in touch over a period of time and keep those connections going. Would you agree? I just want to make sure I understand your
Mm-hmm.
stance on this, that we do have a finite amount of people that we can really maintain close relationships with within our sphere.
I think that there's so there's all this theory about Dunbar's number, right? That like, what is it, 150 people? Have you come across this?
Yeah.
Uh, yeah,
Yeah, I have. Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
not sure how well researched that is. In the sense that I know that there's the famous study on it, which is it relates a section of the mammalian brain to our social ties, and so like looked at wolves or something like that, and then in other species, and then Dunbar said, okay, based on the area in the human brain, it would be about 150. I don't know if there's ever like I've never studied this. It's not my area of science, right? I'm not a neuroscientist. I don't know if it's like really ever been proven to a major degree. Uh, Also, I don't know how relevant it is uh, because we're nowhere near there in reality. The average American in 1985 had 3 close friends besides family. By 2004, we were down to 2. And that's mostly because people were moving. And so it reset their social ties. Now, because of the pandemic, that's probably even smaller. I would be ecstatic if most people had 10 friends. I'd be beyond ecstatic if they had so many friends that they couldn't keep track of the number of friends they have. But I don't think that's the real problem most of us are facing.
Well,
I
another way
think,
of looking at that, just to interject here for a second,
please.
you could, even if it is possible to have, say, a certain number of friends that's, beyond the 150 or whatever that number is, there would only be a certain amount of quality time you could spend with whatever group of friends you have. So it's almost like, do we have a choice to invest in a certain number of friends, like expand that out and have more, say, superficial relationships? Or if we had, say, 5 friends that we really connected on a regular basis and were more, like we talked about before, vulnerable and went deep, would that be a better thing because of the depth and quality of that relationship? Just curious your thoughts on that.
I think it, first of all, depends on the person, right? So one of the classic characteristics of what we call introverts is that they're better with smaller group, strong social ties, right? Um, and if that's what really works for you, do it. For me, what ends up happening is that one summer I'll have like one group of 10 friends that I hang out with a lot because we were in the same city for that summer. And I'll have my like core group of like, oh, these are my 10 closest friends that I'm just constantly in touch with. I'm texting, I'm calling. It doesn't matter what city they're in. I'll like talk to them several times a week. Uh, and then there are the people who are kind of like, they float in and out depending on their availability. Then, Jesse, you just had your first kid. So if you might be available less. So I'd go and hang out and I'll switch somebody out until you're like, oh, then when I have my kid, then we'll do birthday parties together and I'll see you more often. Right. So it's not like, maybe if you grew up in a small town, you've got the same friends for 50 years. But most of us, especially when we move and get new jobs, like our social ties change from month to month, year to year. And that's okay. I think it's really, really important to have a handful of super close people. I'd say somebody that you can really confide in is important. Like that person that you can talk to and say the things that really give you anxiety and stress at the bare minimum. Somebody that you can really count on in case of an emergency. Like who's that person that's going to bail you out of jail because you got too rambunctious at a party in Tahoe? Something, I don't know what, Tijuana, not Tahoe. So, uh, and then someone that you can laugh with is probably really important, right? Like who's the one that helps you reduce your stress?
In my world,
Yeah, I mean, yeah, sure.
my wife, my daughter.
Yeah.
What about you?
For me, my wife, for sure. I have a friend, my best friend Liam, who's the co-star of my first book, The 2 a.m. Principle. I mean, we'll get on a call and like we'll be giggling within seconds. It's like we're little school kids. Um, so there are people like that in my life, where my cousins like that, Amit, where there's a not you couldn't get a productive sentence out of the two of us in a 2-hour conversation, and and we still will not have figured out what we were going to have for dinner, right? Because we're giggling too much, and that kind of stuff seems to really make a difference. Because if you look, when you're part of a community or you feel a true sense of belonging, things that are stressful become less stressful. Things that are joyous become more joyous. And uh, my inclination is to think that it's really important to have a healthy mix of both really deep ties, right? Super close friends and family, or family, like some people can, biological family isn't an option. And uh, loose ties would be like, you know, people you'll hang out with every 3 months for drinks or catch up with over email or Zoom or whatever it is. But to judge that all of your ties have to be super close is not a very fair or realistic expectation, especially as people go through life moments, right? When you have your second kid, how much socializing time are you going to have? Like, let's be honest.
Well, I'm curious for you, John. You mentioned your wife. When you started these influencer dinners, were you in a relationship? And if
Oh,
so,
no.
or actually if not, okay, you weren't. How has that changed things in your, relationship with this community?
It's caused one issue that was unexpected, which is that the dinner alum will meet her and kind of forget about me because she's so much cooler. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but my close friends from the dinners that meet her are like, "Oh, she's awesome," especially the women, and they'll be like, "Okay, we're taking her away for a few days or something like that," and they'll go have like a ladies' weekend somewhere, which I love. Like, it makes me super happy. I think one of the reasons that it really works between me and my wife is that she couldn't care less about the people at the dinners, in the sense that like their status means nothing. She likes them as people, but it's not like, oh my god, that person has an Academy Award. That's so cool. can you introduce me? Like, I'll run a dinner in my home, and she'll be like, yeah, I'm gonna hang out with the cat in the bedroom. Don't bother me. And I'm like, okay. I'm like, do you want to meet? No, I'm gonna watch This Is Us and hang out with our cat. I have plans. Don't bother.
Does she attend a lot of the dinners though?
No, she's come to a couple, and she's very impressive in her own right. She leads groups involving AI and machine learning. She's done it at Walmart and now at Amazon. So smart woman. Yeah.
So John, I can see from, this example, this community you've created, you've shared a lot of knowledge and things that you've learned forming this and maintaining these relationships. But what I'm curious about is for somebody like me or somebody that's listening to this show who, you know, we have friends, we have community in our lives, hopefully. But we're not going to, take it near to this extent that you have. What can we take from what you've learned and apply it in a smaller way? So other than the obvious, which is like to, grab some ingredients from the grocery store and have a couple friends over and make a dinner together, reenact what you're doing in a smaller way. Let's talk about some of the core things that we can use to improve our relationships from what you've learned.
So the first thing I would say is actually don't do the dinner thing. And the reason is that dinners tend to suck. And I know that sounds super weird, but I am not a big fan of business dinners or things like that in general. And the reason is that they tend to be really awkward. The biggest recommendation I have is human beings connect over shared interests, activities, or culture, right? So, where do you live?
In
Not
Ontario.
exact address. In Ontario. Great.
Yeah, Ontario.
Are there certain cultural holidays in Ontario that like are a really big deal? Like, in the US, we celebrate 4th of July. I know Canada has its own Thanksgiving.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of them are similar to in the US. So yeah.
So, I mean, it might be like really nice to do a cultural event or something like that, right? But that's generally how people meet. The problem is that people think, oh, I have to connect with people. They go and try to network, and networking just sucks. In fact, research has shown that people feel dirty. So, if you'll notice, it's shared activities, interests, culture, things like that are all opportunities to put in joint effort. My biggest recommendation is find things that you actually enjoy to do or care about, and then invite people to come along. Now, that might be you might like hiking, you might like knitting, you might like racing cars, you might like playing golf, whatever it is, doesn't matter. It just needs to be something that you enjoy. Something that you enjoy that you can invite others to participate in that has a shared effort. We are far more likely to feel connected from going on a hike together than we are from sitting and eating facing each other, interviewing one another across a table and meeting for the first time. And that's just the nature of human being. We evolved in groups that participated in activities. Those activities allow us to have that Ikea effect, that shared effort, those vulnerability loops as we figure things out together. And so the biggest takeaway is if we actually want to connect with people and build trust with them, do shared activities that you actually enjoy. Now, there are thousands of them. You can literally go onto like meetup.com or Groupon or whatever it is. I mean, there was a time before COVID that my wife and I would literally go on to Groupon and find every dessert making class that you could find. So we would learn to make sorbet and macaroons and but every couple of weeks we'd go and do one. And it's super fun. But that is, in my mind, such a fun date night in comparison to let's go out to a restaurant and stare at each other. And it's nice. It's like can be romantic, but it's not active, right? So cooking is great. Flower arranging is great. Uh, kickball is great, right? And now, if you want to use it as an opportunity to meet new people, especially very impressive people, then look at those 4 characteristics we talked about. Is it generous? Is it novel? Is it well curated? Is it awe inspiring? When it comes to curation, just increase the curation slowly over time. My first dinners weren't super impressive, but over time, the guests became more and more impressive as we hosted more and more impressive guests. So if I said, oh, yeah, last week we had that Emmy Award winner and that Nobel laureate, well, it wasn't, in the early days, it wasn't a Nobel laureate. It's usually like an Emmy Award winner, like a Pulitzer Prize winner because they wrote some article. Then the next time when I talk to people, I go, oh, yeah, we just hosted those. And they're like, oh, that gives it credibility. Yeah, okay, that seems like something I would do. And so it increases the status over time. As far as increasing novelty, that's surprisingly easy to do. So if you have a hike, one way to increase novelty is say each person needs to bring one problem with them. And we're committed that the 5, 6 people who are on the hike are going to solve each other's problems by the end of the hike. So now you have the vulnerability loops, the Ikea effect. You have a novel format, and you're doing something that is actually enjoyable and beautiful, as opposed to, yes, let's go out for drinks and not remember most of the night and whatever. Right? So one is like a really healthy collection of pro-social activities. The other is, maybe it could be really fun and great. Don't get me wrong. If you've read my first book, you know that I have no problem with nights out drinking. It's just not necessarily what's going to develop the longest lasting relationships. So does that kind of answer the question?
That makes sense. And in that, you touched on a word I want to come back to, and that's networking, which is a word that can make many of us cringe. And I'm just curious, how do we, define the boundary of what networking is versus bringing people together, to form new relationships in this healthy way that you're recommending? So let's talk about if there's any overlap there and what the differences are.
So I think that this might be like one of these, you know, that classic definition. I don't know, I can't define what pornography is, but I know it when I see it. Uh, it's it's a little tough to define what networking is versus not. But what you know is that feeling, and the feeling is that you're interacting with somebody just for a transaction, not because you feel like the potential for friendship. People feel dirty when they're transacting like that, and it makes them want to avoid the experience. And if you look, I think it was a study on either Columbia grad students or MBA students or something like that, that they just go to events knowing how important it is to network, but only talk to the people they already know. And that's because it's not a pleasant experience. We don't have that negative experience when we're making friends. And so the question is the activity designed to develop friendships, or is the activity designed to produce transaction? And that's why I don't like a lot of, networking events and things like that, is that you're essentially putting yourself in a situation where people are not going to want to know you for you, but for the business opportunity. And that's fine, but then there's probably a better way to do it. And more importantly, wouldn't you rather have an affinity for and like the people you do business with? It'll lead to a longer, business relationship and longer retention of the customer. And that sounds a lot more appealing in my mind.
I hear you. Let's talk about what goes on in the body when we're forming these relationships. Can you talk about the physiology, the changes that occur, and why it's so healthy?
Oh, for sure. So there's, I think, 2 sides of it. One is what happens when we don't have it, right? So when we're experiencing loneliness, it turns out to be almost on par with smoking a pack a day of cigarettes. It's pretty profound. Now, there's this researcher by the name of Matt Lieberman who ran a series of experiments examining how the brain processes social pain, right? Like isolation, neglect, like all these kinds of things. Um, and when looking at brain scans, almost the identical brain regions are active when people are experiencing social pain and when they're experiencing physical pain. And that's really interesting because we're used to thinking of them as two different things. If somebody punched me, I'd be able to, go to the police and they'd go to jail. But if somebody made fun of me, it would be a little weird to send them to jail, right? But the damage as the brain processes it might be really, really similar. And in fact, Lieberman found that when people were given painkillers, they didn't experience social pain, meaning that pain is pain, and that painkillers can affect the way that we process these things, which is why when people are very lonely and isolated and depressed, it's easy to self medicate with drugs and alcohol. So when people feel lonely, it actually increases their stress levels, cortisol, right? Like all the classic markers. It increases anxiety. It actually distracts them, making them less productive at work. And it reduces their sleep, which then once again reduces their productivity, focus, and all of this combined actually reduces immune response, right? So like the entire process is pretty incredibly terrible for you. In the most extreme cases, sometimes seen when long-time spouses pass away and people are widowed, there's something called broken heart syndrome, where this is in very extreme cases, a person can become so sad that their heart literally stops functioning properly and they die from it. So, yeah, broken heart syndrome, right? Now, when you experience pro-social behavior, right, those vulnerability loops, when I signal vulnerability, you signal back, and we complete the loop, it's very likely that we actually release oxytocin, which is that cuddle chemical. And that, as a result, brings us closer together, but it also supports pro-social behavior. So, Jesse, when you get like some really good news,
Oh yeah.
right? And you're like on cloud nine, do you notice how you're nicer to everybody?
Yeah, I do.
Right? Like the world looks great, your outlook looks great.
Yeah, your outlook is so positive, and yeah, I can totally feel that.
So when we experience a high level of pro-social behavior, like we actually treat everybody better, and that spreads. And so this is research by Paul J. Zak. He found things like if you if your team wins the soccer match, you don't just treat your teammates better, you also treat the team that didn't win better, right? There's all these things that occur when we bond that actually have huge health benefits. So it reduces stress, increases focus, like basically the reverse of all that loneliness stuff. And so it's pretty profound, and then also becomes really clear why when you look at the greatest predictors of human longevity, it isn't, kale cleanses and probiotics. It's number two, close social ties, and number one, something called social integration, that you come in contact with a lot of people by being that you're part of a community. Um, and so I think that that's pretty wonderful. It's also shouldn't surprise us at all that human beings need each other.
And you mentioned the kale smoothie there. I'm curious, why do you think that kind of stuff gets so much attention versus the relationships when really the relationships is something that we can work on right away and we don't need anything? I mean, it should be the easiest thing to implement right away.
It really should. Uh, I think the answer is that it's easy to spend $12 and it's hard to be uncomfortable. So I can pick up a kale smoothie or whatever it is, and it's really probably just covered in sugar anyway. But and you're like, oh, I deserve it. It's $12. Whatever, right? You throw it on a credit card, or you get it. What's the big thing now that you get it sent to you frozen in those boxes, like Daily Harvest? But it's not, you know, I think that friendships, one, require effort, and two, uh, we've forgotten how much people need to connect and how good it is for us. There's this concept in technology, which is like remove all the barriers, make it as easy as possible for people to do stuff. You look at Amazon, it's like one click. Wow, right? You already have everything that you never knew you didn't need. And as a byproduct, it's become easier and easier to do everything. And now I don't have to know my dry cleaner's name. Now I don't need to know the person at the local market, right? All these people become faceless and we no longer have social ties. Whereas it used to be that you knew your butcher and your the person who ran the market and so on and so forth. And so modern life isn't that healthy for us. And so I think it's all the places where friction has been reduced has made life go faster and more accessible, but not necessarily better for us.
I hear what you're saying.
And I think we're the first generation, or like the one that's coming up now, that's expected to live less than the previous one, which is like, shocking.
I've heard that stat as well. And Jon, for somebody who's listening or watching right now, and maybe they feel like their relationships, they're not where they want them to be. And I'm sure that's a lot of people because it's a continuum. I mean, it's not, and it's very subjective. But somebody that's listened to this and they're ready to, make a step in the right direction, what's a small win that they can, take part in right after this to help get them propelled in that direction? Would it be to send a text message like you talked about earlier, just reaching out to say you're awesome to somebody, or what's something easy that people can do after listening to this?
I think the easiest thing is invite somebody for a walk. And the reason I say that is that even if you're introverted, you can handle a walk with one person. If you're extroverted, great. Have 10 people take a walk with you. I have a friend who organizes huge walks with like 40 people. He calls them saunters. They're awesome. It's super fun to meet everybody. Not necessary, right? Just go take a walk with one person, have a conversation, and remember how nice it is to connect with people. And the reason I emphasize this is that you don't need to do things at a large scale to really improve the quality of your life. And what's nice about a walk is that if you run out of things to say, there'll be beautiful things in the environment, or at least interesting things in the environment that you can talk about, or you could just enjoy walking. You don't have to fill the silence all the time. Whereas if you meet for drinks, you've got to you feel obligated to talk at each other.
That makes sense. And Jon, other than listeners getting a copy of You're Invited, how can they connect with you after the show?
They can get several copies. No, I'm kidding. The easiest way to get a hold of me is I have a website, Jon Levy TLB, JonLevy, T like Thomas, L like lion, B like boy. And I'm Jon Levy TLB on all the platforms. So Instagram, Clubhouse, Facebook, Twitter. And so feel free to reach out. I'm most easily responsive to stuff on Instagram and through my website.
All right. It's all going to be linked up in the show notes. And Jon, really appreciate your time. This conversation, we went really deep and covered a lot. I had a lot of fun chatting with you. Thank you.
This is great, Jesse. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks again.